Solve my wrong piece of compass, and that's for first.
They called it impossible long before the first blade was lifted, long before the first order was whispered into the dark. Impossible not because it lacked courage, or numbers, or conviction, but because the very idea of victory violated everything humans believed about power, distance, endurance, and time. It was a war that should never have been fought, because logic itself stood in the way. And yet, it happened. This was not a clash born from hatred alone. It was born from certainty. From the quiet, dangerous belief that the world had already been measured, that all outcomes were predictable, that some forces were simply too vast to resist. On one side stood an authority that believed history moved only in one direction. On the other stood people who understood something far more unsettling, that history does not move forward, it fractures. Every step taken toward this war felt like a mistake. Every calculation insisted the same answer: collapse, failure, annihilation. The terrain rejected movement. The climate punished persistence. The supply lines mocked ambition. The numbers refused to balance. Even nature seemed aligned against the idea. And yet, plans were drawn. Orders were signed. Lives were committed. What makes this war disturbing is not the violence that followed. Violence is common in history. What makes it disturbing is the calm before it. The confidence. The assumptions shared quietly across rooms of power. The belief that some outcomes were guaranteed not by effort, but by inevitability. That belief would be tested, not by force alone, but by psychology. Because this war was not decided by who struck harder. It was decided by who understood fear differently. Who understood patience. Who understood that humans do not break when they are weak, but when they believe resistance no longer matters. Long before the first decisive moment, something invisible was already shifting. Something overlooked. Something dismissed as irrelevant. There were moments when this war almost ended before it began. Moments when a single decision, made in silence, could have erased everything that followed. But those moments passed unnoticed, buried under routine, tradition, and overconfidence. History often turns not on dramatic choices, but on the ones considered too small to matter. What followed reshaped borders, beliefs, and the very definition of power. Not immediately. Not cleanly. The change crept in slowly, disguised as exhaustion, as necessity, as compromise. By the time the world realized what had happened, it was already irreversible. This is not the story of a flawless victory or a noble defeat. It is the story of misjudgment, on every side. Of strategies that made sense on paper and failed in reality. Of minds trained for one kind of war, forced into another. Of an impossible conflict that revealed a truth history keeps trying to forget: the greatest defeats begin as unquestioned assumptions. And once those assumptions collapse, nothing remains the same. To understand how this impossible war came into existence, the file must be opened slowly, layer by layer, without rushing to judgment. Because on the surface, the balance of power seemed so obvious that resistance itself appeared irrational. One state dominated the Western Mediterranean with unmatched resources, disciplined institutions, and a population accustomed to prolonged warfare. The other had already lost once, and the scars of that defeat still shaped every decision it made. At the center of this confrontation stood the Roman Republic, a system built not on brilliance, but on endurance. Rome did not rely on single leaders or moments of genius. It relied on repetition, structure, and replacement. Armies could be destroyed, generals could fall, but new legions would always march in their place. Its strength was not speed or creativity, it was inevitability. To fight Rome was to accept a war of attrition that few could survive. Opposing this was Carthage, a maritime power whose wealth flowed from trade, not territory. Carthage excelled at commerce, naval warfare, and diplomacy. But it lacked the demographic depth of Rome. Its armies were often composed of allies and mercenaries, effective, but politically fragile. Decades earlier, these two powers had already collided in a brutal struggle remembered as the First Punic War. Rome had emerged victorious, stripping Carthage of territory, prestige, and strategic confidence. That defeat mattered more psychologically than materially. It taught Carthage that conventional confrontation led only to gradual suffocation. Direct naval rivalry favored Rome. Defensive wars favored Rome. Time itself favored Rome. Any future conflict would require a complete rejection of traditional logic. This realization shaped the worldview of one family above all others. The Barcid lineage did not interpret Rome's victory as proof of Roman superiority, but as evidence of Carthaginian restraint. They believed the earlier war had been lost not because Rome was stronger, but because Carthage had lacked imagination. Among them emerged a commander whose thinking would redefine the boundaries of warfare itself, Hannibal Barca. Hannibal inherited more than command. He inherited resentment, memory, and a long-term strategy forged in exile from the sea. Carthage, barred from expansion in Italy and constrained on the water, had turned inland, consolidating power in the Iberian Peninsula. There, far from Roman oversight, Carthaginian influence grew quietly. Silver mines funded armies. Alliances hardened. Soldiers trained under real conditions, not ceremonial drills. This was not preparation for defense, it was preparation for a single, decisive gamble. Rome, meanwhile, misread these developments. From the Roman perspective, Carthage was contained. The treaties were clear. The borders were distant. Iberia was a peripheral concern, a place for later intervention, not immediate alarm. Roman confidence did not come from arrogance alone, it came from precedent. Every major rival Rome had faced eventually collapsed under sustained pressure. History, as Romans understood it, moved in one direction. What made the coming war impossible was not just geography, but doctrine. Roman military thinking was built around the assumption that large armies moved by sea or through friendly territory. Any serious invasion of Italy would require naval dominance or political invitation. Carthage possessed neither. The idea that a foreign army could appear in the Italian heartland without ships was not merely unlikely, it was dismissed as fantasy. Between Iberia and Italy stood rivers, hostile tribes, and the towering barrier of the Alps. These mountains were not just physical obstacles, they were conceptual ones. No major army had ever crossed them with the intention of immediate invasion. The climate alone seemed prohibitive. Snow, narrow passes, rock slides, altitude sickness, each factor independently discouraged movement. Together, they rendered planning meaningless. Rome did not guard the Alps because no one serious would attempt to cross them. This assumption shaped everything that followed. Roman forces were positioned to meet threats from the sea or from the south. Garrisons watched familiar routes. Senators debated predictable scenarios. In doing so, Rome committed one of history's most subtle errors, it prepared perfectly for the wrong war. The declaration of hostilities, remembered as the beginning of the Second Punic War, did not initially provoke panic in Rome. Wars with Carthage were expected to be slow, distant, and ultimately manageable. Rome believed it understood Carthage's limits. It believed it understood Hannibal's options. And most dangerously, it believed it understood reality itself. For Hannibal, the objective was not immediate conquest. He did not intend to storm Rome in a single blow. His strategy was psychological and political. Rome's power depended on its network of allies, Italian states bound by fear, obligation, and habit. If those allies could be shaken, if Rome could be shown to be vulnerable on its own soil, the entire system might fracture. Victory would come not through occupation, but through erosion of belief. This distinction mattered. Rome prepared to defeat an army. Hannibal prepared to defeat an idea. As forces gathered and decisions hardened into commitments, both sides believed time favored them. Rome trusted its systems. Carthage trusted its commander. Neither fully grasped how narrow the margin for error truly was. The war that followed would not unfold according to precedent. It would move where it was least expected, strike where it was least defended, and expose weaknesses that had been hidden beneath centuries of success. By the time Rome realized that the rules it relied upon no longer applied, the war was already inside its mind, long before it ever reached its walls. The tension did not begin with battle. It began with silence. With reports that sounded exaggerated. With messengers who struggled to explain what they themselves barely understood. Somewhere beyond Rome's northern horizon, something was moving that should not have been able to move at all. For the Roman Republic, war planning was a matter of balance sheets and probabilities. How many legions could be raised? How many allies would answer the call? How long supply lines could be sustained? Roman confidence rested on numbers, and the numbers always favored them. Even if an enemy general proved clever, Rome assumed it could absorb losses until inevitability reasserted itself. This assumption had survived generations of conflict. It had become doctrine. But tension grows when doctrine encounters the unfamiliar. Hannibal Barca was advancing not with speed, but with intention. His army was not large by Roman standards, and it was shrinking by the day. Men were lost to cold, to disease, to desertion. Pack animals slipped into ravines. Equipment was abandoned. The march through the Alps was not a triumphal maneuver, it was controlled deterioration. Every step forward required calculation. How much loss could be endured without collapsing morale entirely? From a purely numerical perspective, this was madness. Rome could field more soldiers in a single season than Hannibal commanded in total. Rome could replace losses, Hannibal could not. Every casualty mattered. Every delay increased risk. And yet, the very fragility of his position became a weapon. His men understood that retreat was impossible. Survival depended on momentum alone. Roman intelligence struggled to interpret this. Scouts reported foreign troops appearing where no enemy should be. Tribal intermediaries delivered contradictory accounts. Some claimed a massive invasion force. Others insisted it was a desperate raid that would soon collapse under its own weight. Roman commanders debated not whether Hannibal would be defeated, but when. This misalignment of expectations is where psychological pressure began to build. Rome prepared to meet an enemy that would arrive exhausted, disorganized, and grateful merely to have survived the mountains. What emerged instead was an army hardened by shared suffering. An army that had already endured what should have broken it. In psychological terms, Hannibal's force had crossed a threshold. Once men survive the impossible, they begin to believe that further impossibilities are survivable as well. The first engagements were meant to be corrective measures, small actions to reassert Roman dominance. Instead, they became sources of unease. Roman cavalry found itself outmaneuvered. Infantry formations encountered tactics that felt unfamiliar, flexible, adaptive. Hannibal avoided decisive confrontation, choosing instead to probe, to observe, to let Roman commanders reveal their habits. Numbers still favored Rome, but pressure does not correlate linearly with numbers. Pressure accumulates where expectations fail. Roman citizens were accustomed to distant wars. Italy itself had rarely felt invaded by a foreign power. The idea that an enemy general was maneuvering freely within the peninsula disrupted something deeper than strategy, it disrupted identity. Rome was not supposed to be reactive. It was the axis around which others reacted. Hannibal understood this imbalance intuitively. He did not rush toward Rome. He moved laterally, striking allied communities, demonstrating reach without committing to siege. Each victory was less about territory and more about messaging. Rome could not be everywhere. Rome could be outthought. Rome could bleed. As reports reached the Senate, tension shifted from confidence to urgency. New legions were raised. Commanders were given broader authority. Yet with each mobilization came another strain, speed. Rome was reacting faster than its system was designed to allow. Hastily assembled forces lacked cohesion. Political appointments outpaced battlefield experience. Fear does not announce itself loudly in empires. It appears as impatience, as overconfidence masquerading as decisiveness, as the need to end uncertainty quickly. Hannibal's army, by contrast, thrived in uncertainty. Its very existence depended on adaptability. Composed of diverse contingents, North Africans, Iberians, Gauls, it functioned not as a rigid machine but as a responsive organism. Hannibal tailored tactics to terrain, to weather, to the psychology of his opponents. He studied Roman patterns with forensic attention. Every Roman move now carried weight beyond its immediate outcome. A lost skirmish raised questions. A delayed engagement fueled rumor. Allied states began to watch carefully, measuring Rome not by proclamations, but by performance. Loyalty in ancient Italy was conditional. Protection mattered more than ideology. The imbalance became clearer with each encounter. Rome was fighting the war it expected. Hannibal was fighting the war that existed. Pressure intensified as casualties mounted, not catastrophic losses, but persistent ones. Roman legions were unaccustomed to fighting an enemy who refused to behave predictably. Battles did not resolve neatly. Victory was ambiguous. Even when Romans held the field, Hannibal's army remained intact, mobile, and dangerous. This prolonged tension had strategic consequences. Roman commanders faced public scrutiny. Senators feared appearing weak. The temptation grew to force a decisive battle, to restore clarity through overwhelming force. Historically, Rome excelled in such confrontations. Its infantry, disciplined and resilient, usually prevailed when allowed to engage directly. Hannibal anticipated this desire. He understood that pressure would not merely push Rome to act, it would push Rome to act in familiar ways. The more Rome sought certainty, the more it would cling to doctrine. The imbalance was no longer just numerical. It was cognitive. Rome's strength, its reliance on established methods, was becoming a liability. Hannibal's weakness, his lack of resources, forced him into creativity. One side sought resolution. The other sought control. As armies maneuvered and seasons turned, the question shifted from whether Hannibal could win, to whether Rome could afford not to confront him directly. Delay favored psychological erosion. Allies whispered. Confidence thinned. The longer the war dragged on without a decisive Roman victory, the more dangerous it became. What Rome did not yet see was that the pressure it felt was not accidental. It was engineered. Hannibal was shaping Roman decision-making, narrowing its perceived options, guiding it toward a moment where instinct would override caution. The stage was being set for a choice that would feel inevitable, but would later be remembered as avoidable. The hidden turn did not arrive with a sudden revelation. It arrived disguised as common sense. By this stage, the Roman Republic believed it had identified the problem and, more importantly, the solution. The enemy was bold but isolated. Clever but constrained. Dangerous only as long as he was allowed to maneuver. The answer, therefore, was not subtlety, but finality. Rome would do what Rome had always done when patience wore thin, it would apply weight. Two consuls were entrusted with this task, men whose temperaments reflected the internal tension of the Republic itself. One favored caution, delay, and containment. The other believed that hesitation itself had become the greater threat. History remembers their disagreement not because it was unusual, but because of what followed. The decision was simple on paper. Assemble an army of unprecedented size. Force engagement. Overwhelm the invader. End the war. Never before had Rome concentrated so much of its military power into a single force. Legion after legion was raised, allied contingents summoned, formations expanded beyond traditional limits. The message was clear, both to the enemy and to Rome's wavering allies, this would be decisive. What is often overlooked is how reassuring this decision felt at the time. It aligned perfectly with Roman identity. Rome did not win wars through tricks. It won them through discipline, courage, and mass. To deviate from that model would have implied that Rome itself was changing, and institutions resist that implication more than they resist danger. Hannibal understood this before the legions ever assembled. He had studied Roman behavior long enough to recognize the pattern. Pressure produced escalation. Escalation produced concentration. Concentration produced predictability. The larger the Roman army became, the less flexible it would be. The more confident it felt, the less it would question its own assumptions. The battlefield chosen for the confrontation, near the small settlement later remembered as Battle of Cannae, appeared ideal for Rome. Open ground. Flat terrain. Perfect for heavy infantry to deploy and advance. The conditions seemed to neutralize Hannibal's adaptability and favor Roman strength. This was the hidden turn, not the battle itself, but the belief that terrain alone dictated advantage. Hannibal arranged his forces in a formation that defied Roman expectations. Instead of reinforcing the center, he weakened it deliberately. His most reliable infantry was positioned on the flanks, while the center consisted of troops expected to give ground under pressure. To Roman observers, this appeared to confirm their assumptions: the enemy line was thin where it mattered most. What Rome did not question was why Hannibal would accept such vulnerability. The Roman plan required no innovation. Advance in dense formation. Break the enemy center. Exploit collapse. End resistance. It was a plan that had worked countless times before, and that familiarity was its greatest flaw. Familiarity dulls curiosity. As the armies engaged, the Roman center pushed forward exactly as intended. Step by step, Hannibal's central line yielded. To Roman commanders, this was confirmation. The enemy was breaking. Momentum increased. The formation compressed further, men pressing forward to participate in what felt like an imminent victory. This compression was fatal. By driving deeper into the retreating center, the Roman army surrendered its greatest advantage: maneuverability. Its mass, once a source of power, became a constraint. Units lost lateral awareness. Commands became harder to relay. The very density designed to overwhelm now prevented adaptation. Meanwhile, Hannibal's flanks remained intact. His cavalry, superior in mobility, had already driven off Roman horsemen. With the Roman infantry fully committed forward, the flanks began to pivot inward, not abruptly, but methodically. The retreating center stabilized. The Roman advance slowed, then stalled, then froze. What followed was not chaos, but suffocation. Encirclement is often imagined as a dramatic moment. In reality, it is incremental. Men realize they cannot turn. Then they realize they cannot retreat. Then they realize the space around them is shrinking. Panic does not erupt immediately, it accumulates. The Roman soldiers at Cannae were among the best trained infantry of the ancient world. They did not break quickly. They held formation. They fought forward. But there was nowhere forward to go. Hannibal had not destroyed them, he had contained them. This was the genius of the decision. Hannibal did not seek annihilation through shock. He engineered exhaustion. Pressure from all sides, constant engagement, no release. Roman discipline prolonged the killing. The better they fought, the longer it took to die. From a psychological perspective, the battle inverted Roman virtues. Order became confinement. Courage became endurance of inevitability. Strength became immobility. The Roman command structure collapsed not because leaders fled, but because leadership had no meaningful options left. Signals could not alter geometry. Valor could not restore space. The system functioned perfectly inside a trap. By the time the encirclement was fully recognized, recognition no longer mattered. This moment, the choice to force a decisive engagement on familiar terms, was the war's most consequential error. Not because it was irrational, but because it was rational within a flawed framework. Rome trusted the logic that had always served it. Hannibal trusted his understanding of Roman psychology. The result was one of the most complete tactical victories in military history. But its true significance was not numerical. It was conceptual. Rome had been defeated not by superior resources, but by superior anticipation. What made this turn hidden was not secrecy, but normalcy. No radical doctrine was announced. No unprecedented technology unveiled. The catastrophe emerged from habits, deeply ingrained, widely respected habits. In the aftermath of the battle, the question was no longer whether Rome could defeat Hannibal in the field. It was whether Rome could survive the realization that its identity had been used against it. The impossible war had crossed a threshold. The unthinkable had occurred. And the consequences of that realization would extend far beyond the bodies left on the field. The climax did not explode. It settled. When the fighting at Cannae finally slowed, it was not because resistance had ended, but because resistance no longer had space to exist. The field became a closed system of exhaustion, heat, and compression. Men were no longer fighting an enemy in front of them. They were fighting the weight of their own formation, the press of bodies, the slow realization that survival had been reduced to minutes, then seconds. Ancient battles usually ended with a break. A line collapsing. A retreat turning into flight. Cannae did not end that way. There was nowhere to flee. The encirclement was complete, not as a dramatic maneuver, but as a mathematical certainty. Movement narrowed until it ceased to matter. Blades rose and fell in inches, not arcs. Orders dissolved into noise, then into breath, then into silence. From a distance, the scene must have looked almost still. Dust hung in the air. The outer lines continued to move, while the center became dense and dark. Those outside the trap could not fully see what was happening inside it. Those inside could no longer see anything at all. This was the true climax of the impossible war, not the brilliance of the maneuver, but the psychological inversion it created. The Roman Republic had built its power on cohesion. At Cannae, cohesion became confinement. The tighter the formation, the more efficiently it was destroyed. Roman soldiers did not panic in the traditional sense. They endured. And that endurance magnified the scale of the loss. Hannibal did not rush the killing. He did not need to. Time was now his ally. His forces maintained pressure, rotated fresh units into the engagement, and allowed exhaustion to do what force alone could not. This restraint is often overlooked. Many commanders would have ordered a chaotic rush to capitalize on advantage. Hannibal understood that chaos favors escape. Control favors finality. As hours passed, the Roman army diminished not through collapse, but through attrition. The dead did not fall away, they remained where they fell, compressing the living further. The wounded could not be carried off. The heat intensified. The psychological weight became unbearable. Yet still, the resistance continued, because Roman training had never prepared soldiers to imagine a battle that could not be resolved by bravery. By the time the sun lowered, what remained of the Roman force was no longer an army. It was a mass of individuals trapped inside a geometry they could not alter. The numbers that emerged afterward stunned the ancient world. Tens of thousands killed in a single day. Consuls, senators, experienced officers, all gone. Rome had lost more men in hours than many states possessed in total. It was not just a defeat, it was a demographic shock. And yet, Hannibal did not march on Rome. This decision has haunted historians for centuries. From a modern perspective, it appears inexplicable. The enemy was shattered. Italy lay exposed. Panic gripped the Roman population. Allied cities hesitated, some defected. Opportunity seemed absolute. But wars are not won by moments alone. Hannibal's army, though victorious, was still constrained. Supplies were limited. Siege equipment was non-existent. Rome's walls were formidable. More importantly, Hannibal understood that the battle's real impact was psychological, not territorial. Rome had been proven vulnerable. The myth had been broken. That fracture would echo longer than any occupation. Inside Rome, the aftermath was existential. The city did not erupt in chaos. It hardened. Mourning was regulated. Public displays of grief were restricted. The Senate convened not to debate surrender, but survival. Every assumption about warfare had to be reconsidered. Rome no longer faced a rival operating within familiar bounds. It faced a mind that anticipated its reactions. This realization was more terrifying than the loss itself. Rome's response was not immediate retaliation, but adaptation. New strategies emerged: avoidance, containment, denial of resources. Direct confrontation was no longer assumed to be the answer. The war shifted from spectacle to endurance. Rome accepted that it could not defeat Hannibal quickly, but it could outlast him. The climax, therefore, extended beyond the battlefield. It unfolded in policy, in psychology, in the quiet recalibration of what victory meant. Hannibal had won the most perfect battle imaginable, and in doing so, forced Rome to abandon the habits that made such a victory possible in the first place. For Hannibal, this was the paradox. His greatest success accelerated Rome's evolution. The Republic began to learn restraint, patience, strategic humility. It learned to refuse the kind of decisive engagement Hannibal required to repeat Cannae. In winning completely, he narrowed his own future options. Allies watched closely. Some joined Hannibal, believing Rome's dominance had ended. Others hesitated, sensing that Rome's response would be slow, but relentless. The Italian peninsula became a landscape of uncertainty, loyalty measured day by day. The climax of the war was not a single scream of defeat, but a long, echoing silence in which every power in the Mediterranean reassessed what Rome truly was. Not invincible. Not fragile. Something far more dangerous, a system capable of absorbing catastrophe and continuing forward, altered but unbroken. Cannae marked the end of one war and the beginning of another, quieter one. A war of attrition, of denial, of time. Hannibal had shattered Rome's certainty. Rome, in turn, began to weaponize its patience. The impossible war had reached its most dramatic point, not because one side had fallen, but because both had been transformed. The question that now hovered over Italy was no longer who could win a battle, but who could survive the cost of learning. The aftermath did not look like defeat. It looked like discipline under strain. In the weeks following Cannae, the Roman Republic did something few societies in history have managed to do after a catastrophe of that scale. It refused to collapse inward. There were no mass purges, no overthrow of institutions, no surrender envoys dispatched in panic. Instead, Rome behaved as though it were already accustomed to the unthinkable, as though endurance itself were a civic reflex. This response baffled observers across the Mediterranean. Cities that had long measured their loyalty by Rome's perceived invincibility began to reassess. Some defected to Hannibal, believing the balance of power had finally shifted. Others waited, watching closely for signs of irreversible decay. The Italian peninsula became a map of hesitation. Every city calculated risk anew, weighing immediate survival against long-term consequences. Hannibal, now deep within Italy, found himself in a paradoxical position. He had done everything required to win, except secure the kind of victory history normally recognizes. He had annihilated armies, shattered myths, and destabilized alliances. Yet Rome itself remained intact. Its walls stood. Its institutions functioned. Its will, though bruised, had not broken. Carthage, meanwhile, hesitated. The city-state Hannibal represented did not fully commit to his success. Political divisions, commercial priorities, and lingering caution from earlier defeats limited the support he received. Reinforcements arrived slowly, if at all. Resources were allocated with restraint rather than urgency. The war that Hannibal was fighting required synchronized commitment across theaters. What he received instead was partial endorsement. This hesitation mattered. Rome adjusted its strategy fundamentally. It stopped seeking glory through decisive battles. Instead, it adopted a posture of denial. Hannibal would be shadowed, contained, starved of opportunity. Roman forces avoided large-scale engagements, focusing instead on protecting loyal allies and isolating defectors. Supply routes were disrupted. Local support was punished or rewarded with calculated severity. This approach felt un-Roman to many contemporaries. It lacked drama. It lacked closure. But it worked. Time, once Hannibal's enemy during the Alpine crossing, now became Rome's ally. Each year Hannibal remained in Italy without decisive reinforcement weakened his position. His army, formidable but finite, aged and thinned. His veterans were irreplaceable. Rome's losses, by contrast, could be replenished. Legions were raised from new generations. Training adapted. Command structures evolved. Perhaps most importantly, Rome learned. The Republic internalized the lesson of Cannae not as a warning against mass, but as a warning against predictability. Commanders were instructed to avoid overcommitment. Flexibility was valued alongside discipline. Caution was no longer equated with cowardice. The culture of command shifted, slowly but irreversibly. This learning process did not occur without pain. Entire regions were devastated. Italian allies suffered reprisals. The war dragged on, year after year, without the catharsis of resolution. But beneath the surface, Rome was transforming into something more resilient than before. Hannibal, for all his brilliance, could not force Rome to revert to its old habits again. The very shock he delivered had inoculated his enemy against repetition. As the years passed, the war expanded beyond Italy. Rome carried the conflict outward, targeting Carthaginian holdings elsewhere. The logic was cold and deliberate. If Hannibal could not be defeated directly, his support structure would be dismantled piece by piece. The war ceased to revolve around one man and became systemic. This shift culminated in a reversal that would have seemed impossible in the aftermath of Cannae. Roman forces landed in North Africa. Carthage, threatened directly, was forced to recall Hannibal from Italy. The general who had terrorized Rome for years returned home not as a conqueror, but as a defender. The final confrontation did not favor Hannibal. Rome now fielded commanders who had grown up in the shadow of his campaigns, men who had studied his methods obsessively. Among them was Scipio Africanus, a leader shaped psychologically by Rome's greatest defeat. Scipio did not seek to out-Hannibal Hannibal. He sought to deny him the conditions that had made earlier victories possible. When the war ended, it did not conclude with Rome's destruction or Carthage's immediate annihilation. Instead, it closed with a shift in hierarchy. Rome emerged altered, hardened, strategically mature. Carthage emerged weakened, constrained, and increasingly dependent on Roman mercy. The long-term impact was profound. Rome's imperial future was forged not in triumph, but in adaptation. The republic that would go on to dominate the Mediterranean did so with a deep institutional memory of vulnerability. It expanded cautiously, systemically, with an eye toward preventing the emergence of another Hannibal. Military doctrine emphasized redundancy, intelligence, and denial. Political structures prioritized continuity over charisma. Carthage, by contrast, never recovered its strategic autonomy. Though it would exist for decades more, its role in history had been decided. The war that was meant to restore its standing instead accelerated its decline. Hannibal's genius, unsupported by a fully aligned state, became a lesson in the limits of individual brilliance. The aftermath of the impossible war was not a clean resolution, but a redistribution of psychological power. Rome learned that it could survive catastrophe. Its enemies learned that defeating Roman armies was not enough. One had to defeat Roman time. History often celebrates decisive moments, but this war's true legacy lay in what followed, the slow, deliberate reshaping of how power was exercised. Rome did not become invincible. It became patient. And patience, when paired with resources and memory, proved far more dangerous. The world that emerged after this conflict was quieter on the surface, but more rigid underneath. Alliances hardened. Expansion became methodical. The flexibility Hannibal exploited was sealed off, replaced by systems designed to absorb shock without changing direction. And yet, beneath this apparent stability, a deeper question lingered. If Rome had needed to be nearly destroyed to learn how to endure, what would happen when future generations forgot that lesson? The final insight of this war does not belong to generals or armies. It belongs to human nature. What made this conflict truly impossible was never geography, numbers, or logistics. Those were only the surface barriers. The deeper impossibility lay in psychology, in the way humans construct certainty, and then mistake that certainty for truth. Long before blades met, both sides were already imprisoned by what they believed could not happen. The Roman Republic believed its strength was permanent because it had always been present. Carthage believed Rome could be undone because it had already been challenged. Hannibal believed that intelligence could compensate for scarcity. Rome believed that mass could compensate for predictability. Each belief was rational. Each belief was incomplete. History often frames this war as a contest between brilliance and endurance. But that framing misses the deeper lesson. This was a war about adaptation under existential threat. About what happens when survival demands not just effort, but transformation. Hannibal's genius lay in understanding how humans respond to pressure. He knew that fear does not always produce collapse. Often, it produces acceleration. Institutions under threat move faster, concentrate force, simplify decisions. In doing so, they become easier to anticipate. Hannibal did not defeat Rome's armies as much as he defeated Rome's expectations of itself. Rome's eventual survival came from an equally uncomfortable realization. That its traditions, once sacred, were not immune to misuse. That discipline without flexibility could be lethal. That courage without awareness could become compliance with disaster. Rome did not win by reclaiming its old identity. It won by temporarily abandoning it. This is the pattern history repeats most quietly. Civilizations rarely fall because they are weak. They fall because they are strong in ways that no longer fit reality. Their systems optimize for the last threat, not the next one. Their confidence becomes inertia. Their success becomes a filter through which all information is interpreted. The impossible war forced Rome to confront this. Not intellectually, but viscerally. Tens of thousands of deaths were required to teach a lesson that could not be learned in debate. From that trauma emerged a state that no longer chased certainty, but managed uncertainty. A state that accepted ambiguity as permanent. Hannibal, conversely, revealed the limits of individual brilliance. His mind reshaped warfare. His victories reshaped Rome. And yet, he could not reshape the political structure behind him. Strategy without institutional alignment can only go so far. Intelligence without reinforcement becomes performance rather than power. There is a temptation to ask whether history would have changed if Hannibal had taken Rome. That question misunderstands the nature of the conflict. The war was never about destruction. It was about belief. And belief had already shifted. Rome no longer believed in its own inevitability. It believed in its capacity to endure change. That belief proved more consequential than any sack of the city could have been. The legacy of this war echoes far beyond antiquity. Every organization, every state, every system that survives long enough eventually confronts its own version of Cannae. A moment where its strengths are turned inward. Where the very traits that once ensured success become liabilities. The danger lies not in the challenge itself, but in the refusal to reinterpret identity. Rome survived because it allowed itself to be humbled without surrendering continuity. That balance is rare. Most entities either cling to identity until they shatter, or abandon it so completely that they dissolve. Rome did neither. It absorbed contradiction and moved forward altered. This is why the impossible war changed history forever. Not because of who won, but because of what was learned under pressure. It demonstrated that power is not the absence of vulnerability, but the capacity to reorganize around it. That the most dangerous enemy is not the one who strikes hardest, but the one who understands how you think. And perhaps the most unsettling lesson is this: the conditions that made Rome adaptable were temporary. Memory fades. Success breeds new assumptions. Systems forget the pain that taught them restraint. The Rome that emerged from this war carried humility within it, but not forever. History suggests that every civilization eventually forgets the moment that taught it how to survive. When that forgetting happens, the impossible becomes possible again,